One late night a week. Most nights of the week, Bryn and Smitty had to go to bed pretty early. They didn't like it much, except that their father used to tell them funny stories. The stories were always about a dog called Jim and the funny things that he did. They especially liked the parts where Jim would accidentally trip up the local policeman in the grocer's shop, and the policeman would fall flat on his face, burying his head, helmet and all, deep in a box of eggs. Then the grocer would rush out to help him, and put his foot on the end of a loose board, which would shoot up and hit him in the face, causing him to fall back into a big stack of tin soup, which would then collapse all over him and also all over the policeman, who was just trying to pull his face out of the smashed eggs. When the policeman was at last on his feet, he'd have so much smashed eggs in his eyes that he wouldn't be able to see, and look straight into another pile of tinned meat. And bang, crash, bing, bong, bang, down it would all come on top, and he would fall back on the grocer, who was just trying to get up. This would send the grocer reeling back into the eggs, where he would sit with his pants soaking wet in the smashed eggs. Then, with little concern, the dog Jim would trot over to the policeman, who was lying knocked out on the floor, and begin to lick the eggs off his nose and ears. All the time their father was telling the story, Bryn and Smitty would lie in bed and laugh and laugh and laugh. They would wriggle and squirm and toss and turn, and Smitty would just about spifflicate himself with laughter when he pushed his head deep into the pillow. On Friday nights there wasn't any story, because Mr. and Mrs. Smith stayed late in town, and Bryn and Smitty were supposed to buy their own tea with some money that Mrs. Smith had left. After that they were supposed to wash themselves and go to bed. But Bryn and Smitty didn't mind missing the story on Friday nights, because that was the night they really did things. They would invite Gormy in for tea. He would always come, because his mother didn't care where he ate his meals. Horsey could never come. His mother was too strict. 4 o'clock, Smitty and Gormy and Bryn would run down to the fish and chip shop and queue up with the other kids. Gormy would buy a coffee bun as well, and they would all run home, taking turns carrying the hot fish and chips under their jerseys to keep their bellies warm. In Smitty's kitchen, they would put all the fish and chips in a big pile on the table and count them out into 3 smaller piles on the paper. One for you, one for you, and one for me. One for you, one for you, and one for me. They would chant together. They would do this until all the chips were counted out. While this was going on, it was a rule that you couldn't eat any of the chips from the main pile. That you could eat them from your own pile if you liked. They never used plates and ate fish with their fingers, and then licked their fingers afterwards. As Gormy said, they had a really nice salty taste. After the fish and chips, everybody would drink a lot of water because the salt made them thirsty. Tea would be over by 5:30, and in the winter then it would be dark enough for them to start haunting the neighbourhood. In the dark they could go straight down to the shops, through people's back gardens and over their fences. It's much quicker than travelling that way, and much more dangerous. Too dangerous, in fact, to do it too often. Sometimes they'd get tangled up on wooden frameworks that men had put up for their runner beans, and Bryn, who was the smallest, was always likely to get himself into a real mess. Then Smitty and Gormy would have to come to his rescue, smashing up the frameworks properly to get him safely over the fence. If he's mad enough he'll want to come with us, why wouldn't we just leave him stuck? It'd teach him to stay home, Gormy would say. The gang's got to stick together, said Smitty. They usually had narrow escapes when this happened, because the man who owned the house, wondering what all the row was about, would come out to have a look. But by then the 3 of them would be away over into the next person's backyard before the man knew what was happening. By the time he did realise what was going on, there were many backyards away from him, rousing other men out of their houses as they clambered over their fences and raced through their gardens. Gormy loved to go into Mrs. Robertson, the minister's place, and run all along her flower beds and pull out her cabbages. Most of the time they didn't just go through houses for shortcuts, but in order to get away quickly when they'd been playing knick-knock. In this game, they would creep up to somebody's front door, ring the bell, then run as fast as they could. If they were chased, they'd have to scramble through other people's houses to get away quickly. When this happened, they all separated, going flat out in different directions, then gradually working their way back to the meeting place in the trees in front of Smitty's. Once or twice, Smitty and Gormy had to wait a long time for Bryn, because he preferred not to run too far, but just to lie flat out in the dark in somebody's garden. Bryn was good at doing this, and would lie still for as much as half an hour without moving, though his heart would be pounding into the ground, and his mouth would be wide open, taking in big gulps of cold air as he tried not to make a noise, even when he was puffing hard. At other times, they would walk into the self-help shop together with a crowd and start helping themselves to a few eggs. Smitty and Bryn would wander around looking interested, while Gormy stood with his back to the egg box and slid some eggs into his pocket. "Why not?" says Gormy. "Doesn't it say help yourself?" As soon as they were outside, Gormy would run down past the picture theatre and biff the eggs onto the big notices, which showed what was coming and what was on at the pictures. Then, on the next morning, while Bryn and Smitty were down getting their messages, they could have a look and see what it looked like with the eggs smashed all over the film stars. They usually looked really funny, especially if Gormy had landed eggs on their faces. But the best fun came at about Guy Fawkes time. This time of the year they would spend Friday nights running past shop doors and throwing in lighted crackers and going for their lives. One time, Gormy, who could be a real mug sometimes, threw a jumping jack into a dairy where a big, tough sort of fella lived. As they ran away up the road, they could hear him coming after them. "Quick, scatter!" yelled Smitty. Gormy went off to the road to the right, and Bryn and Smitty went straight on. 100 yards up the road, in a dark part away from the light, Bryn crossed over to the opposite side and lay flat on his stomach. Pressing himself into the side of the gutter, Smitty went further on and round a corner. Meanwhile, the footsteps were coming up fast behind them. The chaser turned off after Gormy. Gradually his footsteps faded away in the distance. Bryn lay there in the gutter for a long time. Smitty by this time was working his way around the back streets and through people's backyards. After a while, Bryn, who was getting pretty cold, quietly climbed out of the gutter and moved slowly back along the path. His eyes were wide open, like those of a cat, watching every sound and movement as the wind rustled in the trees on both sides of the street. He turned up the road that Gormy had taken, padding along quietly in the dark. Then, just as if the whole night of the long street had burst upon him, a great black shape seized him hard. "Gotcha! Oh, throw crackers in my shop, would you? I'll teach you kids." Strong, biting fingers gripped Bryn by the upper arms and shook him up and down. "I'll teach you." He shook him again. "What's your name?" Bryn didn't say anything, his breath coming in quick jerks, fear starting in his throat. He bit his lip and didn't say anything. "Come on, you. I haven't got time to waste." Up came his knees, bump, 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 into Bryn's trousers, till he winced. "Come on, I've got a shop to look after." He shook Bryn some more, bumped him again, and started to drag him down the road towards the shops. "Had enough of you kids. This isn't the first time you've thrown crackers into my shop, my boy." "Oh, it is." "Oh, it was you then." "No, it wasn't me." "Oh, it wasn't, was it? Well, who was it then?" "Don't know." "Yes, you do. Come on, who was it?" But Bryn said nothing, and the man shook him harder than ever, until sobs caught at his bottom lip. He felt himself starting to cry. "Now look here, my boy, either you tell me, or I'll take you along to the police station." "I'll tell my father," sobbed Bryn. "That won't do you any good. Come on." And he dragged Bryn even further along the road, but Bryn let his legs go limp, and the man had to take all his weight. Then he let go of Bryn's arms, and Bryn slumped to the ground. "Get up!" And in a flash, Bryn was up and running in the dark, running as hard as he could go, back the way he had come. Wouldn't tell him, pounded through his head as he ran. He didn't throw it, Gormy threw it. He wouldn't tell. "Stop!" cried the man. He ran after him. Bryn ran and ran, pounded on until he could no longer hear the man behind him. Still he raced on, alone now, with the dark night streaming past his face. At the end of the street he stopped. He was puffing hard. There was no one coming. He was safe. He ran on again for several streets, hardly knowing how to think or what to feel. He was as black as a hollow inside as the night was outside. His heart was big, pumping, fluttering in his chest. It was a close go. He wiped his eyes. They mustn't see his tears. He can't cry. Several streets on, he stopped under a big tree, gave 3 little whistles. From the top of the tree came back an echo. 3 more little whistles. Yep, it was Gormy all right. He usually climbed that tree when they were getting chased. Well, he didn't catch us, said Gormy, as he dropped to the ground. He got me, said Bryn. Phew, did he? What did you do? Did you tell? Nah, he was still puffing. What did you do? Gormy was urgent. I escaped. Phew, said Gormy. Where is he now? Dunno. It was all your fault, too. You threw the cracker. You were in on it. But they didn't argue about it. They made their way a long way home through the deep night, walking out of light and darkness as they passed under the yellow shimmer of a lamppost light here and there. To get home, they had to pass through the park, and so, just to show how tough they were, Gormy tipped over 2 seats, and the seats rolled madly right down the bank. Then Bryn, even though he was still feeling a bit scared, pulled out a notice which read, "No playing on Sunday, by order," and pitched that down after the seats. That'd show him. Gormy wasn't any tougher than he was. Next door to the park was a tennis club, and as they passed, Gormy said, "Get ready to run. Here goes a brick." He hurled a brick, crash, right onto the roof. A door opened. There was a blaze of light, and somebody came out. But by this time, Bryn and Gormy were far down the road, running as fast as they could go. When they arrived at their street, Gormy went into his place, and Bryn went into his. Smitty was already home and reading in bed. Bryn told him all about it, chucked his clothes in the corner, put on his pajamas and crawled with dirty feet, face and hands in between the nice clean sheets. His face and hands had been on the hard ground a lot of times that night, but there was no place so good and warm and soft as his bed. "Put out the light, Smitty," said Bryn. "Oh, I want to read." "Oh, go on." "I can't sleep with the light on." "All right, shut up." And so the light went out, and long before Mr. and Mrs. Smith arrived home, Bryn and Smitty were sleeping soundly, quietly in their bed. When Mr. Smith and Mrs. Smith did arrive home, Mr. Smith looked in the door and saw the top of Bryn's snowy head flopping on his pillow, and the top of Smitty's dark one just peeping above his blankets. And he turned quietly to Mrs. Smith. "Quick, come here, dear. See, don't they just look like a pair of angels lying there in bed?" And so they did.